Hi, everybody. This is Tom Broussard. It is Thursday, April 20th, and I'm glad to see everybody coming here today. Today, I'm going to talk about the Rosetta Stone of aphasia recovery. It's always interesting, to me anyway. I don't know how it is for all of you. But after my stroke, and now it's almost 10 years since my stroke, I obviously spent a lot of time thinking about how I would get better and how all of this would really happen. And most of what I had to figure out were things that I wasn't really aware how it would get better. So that was always an interesting thing. And I came up, of course, with all these different metaphors that helps me better understand how the brain works. But I still didn't know how it was that I got better along the way. It wasn't until much, much later when I began to write it down and help people explain that it turned out that a lot of the work I was doing, turned out to be highly therapeutic. And again, not yet realizing just how the brain works, such that these persistent and repetitive language activities that makes them the Rosetta Stone. That is how we get better. Again, not realizing until you start reading about the 10 principles of neuroplasticity, and repetition and intensity and persistent are all part of how the brain really does work. It doesn't get better other than doing these types of activities. So that's how I began to understand that no matter how metaphors that I could come up with, they all have something to do with the fact that we get better based on these persistent activities, whatever they might be, whatever modality they might be, reading, writing, and speaking. So in my case, although I had a Rosetta Stone when I was young, not sure where my parents got it, but I wouldn't bet that they got it from London and brought it to me on one of their trips. But I always had that in my mind. I could always assume that this Rosetta Stone was always the key to figuring out what's going on with some knowledge. I didn't know what that would be. I just remembered having it, feeling it, understanding it, always understanding the 3 different languages. That was always important to me back then, just as a kid. And it wasn't until after my stroke when I began to at least appreciate that I had my reading, writing, and speaking, those 3 things, not unlike the Rosetta Stone, were each damaged in different ways, almost translating between the 3 of them, such that one presented itself one way, another way, another way. And then I began to figure out how that could be, that parts of my language were more or less damaged for whatever the good reasons might have been, including, as I mentioned in the article, evolutionary, I'm sure, given that we humans, been able to speak for 1 million years and only able to write for, several thousands of years. So completely different, such that the way the brain works and etches in the pattern by which we learned how to communicate. But this is sort of, again, this process by which I got better, including the fact that I saved all the evidence. I know I've told you this 1,000 times, and that's why I come up with these different metaphors that helps you better understand it from a new perspective. But given that I kept a diary, which turned out to be the 500-page diary, and I recorded myself, not every day, but for 2 years, with 202 recordings of myself. I did those things without anybody telling me to do them or me doing it, that it was somehow therapeutic. It was just my habit to do it, and habit has a huge component of how you get better after your stroke, given what you had built in your body and your mind before your stroke. So I kept track and saved all the evidence in various modalities. And one of them, of course, was, even though I couldn't write terribly well, I could keep graphs and charts and metaphorical drawings, and I kept a report card, basically a report card, and it was awful. My writing was D minus. I figured that was better than an F, but not much better. My speaking was C plus, understanding and audio was C plus, and writing was C minus. Because I could read individual words, but I couldn't read a train of information, you know, a sentence or a paragraph, never mind an article or a book. And I wrote that down, and but I had been getting reports, feedback from my therapist, and it did appear, at least according to the objective scores, that my language was going up. And I began to see it in my brain, not that I could express it to anybody else, but I could tell that that something was wrong. Not only that the three modalities were damaged differently, but the fact that I thought my language was doing badly within these different modalities, and apparently my feedback from my therapist that I was going up. And I brought my report card to see my doctor, Dr. Burns, and I showed him my report card, and he responded nicely, you know, that I was doing better, but I couldn't tell him even that there seems to be this disconnect between what I saw from the grades from my therapist, different from the report card that I had. And again, that came later as I became more aware and became more educated about how all this process would go forward. And those definitely are components of how we get better. You have to be more aware of your deficits before you can really understand what those deficits might be. And you have to be educated about how the brain really does work and the structure by which it works. Being aware first, and then educating you about the process by which the brain works. But in my case now, I tell you now, back then I didn't understand it at all. I just did it by habit, and I was very lucky that I did it by habit, quite accidental. But I do urge therapists now to start the evidence-based material earlier. Tell us, even if we're not necessarily not aware, tell us we need to write things down. It doesn't matter if it's bad. As I told you, the first 200 pages, the words didn't make any sense, but it was the fact that I did them on purpose almost every day. That the brain still has that capacity to understand what's good and what's bad, even if I'm not able to express it, or even not even able to express it on the inside. I just wrote what I thought looked fine, and I did that every single day for a long, long time, 2 years plus. And that turns out to be the therapeutic component that induces plasticity. I know we talked about that a lot, but to the degree that plasticity grows and molds the brain in a certain way, it will only do that with the activities themselves. So they really come together. And the full word is experience-dependent neuroplasticity. Experience-dependent drives neuroplasticity and induces neuroplasticity. So it almost doesn't matter yet if you're not necessarily aware, not necessarily educated about the information, but still I am urging people to start a long-term process to build a structure that can continue to be highly therapeutic without yet knowing that you're necessarily aware that what you are working on, the activities you're working on, turn out to be as therapeutic as they need to be in terms of inducing plasticity. So the persistent and repetitive activities of reading, writing, and speaking, no matter how bad they might be at the beginning, it is important. And that's why I urge the therapist and the people with aphasia and their family to better understand earlier in the process, before you leave with your formal therapy, to leave with a plan, a written prescription that tells you, here, if you do these things, as I have been doing with you for the last, in my case, it was 6 months between my SLP and my group, for 6 months, building this structure of these various activities such that at the end of the day, with the structure now in place, before you now leave with your therapist, the therapist leaves you, and now you have this structure of persistent, repetitive activities that will help you continue to get better going forward with that structure. As I say, quite accidentally it might be. It was accidentally for me. I didn't know that what I was doing was the best thing I could have done. I didn't know that it was the Rosetta Stone of aphasia recovery. Thank you very much once again for listening to me and my metaphors, helping us better understand how the brain works as we go forward. It is not an easy process, that is for sure. On the one hand, on the other hand, it does seem that we have this capacity to continue to have to get better based on more stimulus. Again, in any number of modalities of reading, writing, and speaking. The more we do it, the better we do going forward. Unless you are asleep, even if that continues to work too, even if you're asleep, or you're no longer alive, other than that, you are able to continue to induce plasticity, to learn on a day-to-day basis, even if it is as simple as any number of things, including just listening and talking about your experience with other people with these similar experiences. Because the way the brain works, it runs very fast, and it is listening to what's happening and beginning to piece things together going forward. So again, I do appreciate it, and I do appreciate this particular article, the Rosetta Stone of Aphasia Recovery, the persistent and repetitive language activities. Thanks again to everybody. I look forward to seeing you in another couple of weeks. I'll tell you again, for the summer, I'm going to go to 1 article instead of 2. I'm working on producing and finishing my 5th book by the fall. So you'll see, starting in May, June, July, and August, we'll all get 1 article instead of 2. Talk to you soon. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.